In the last hours of July 3, 2014, while barbecue smoke and fireworks powder settled over every town in America, a flight of Black Hawks ran blacked out and low across the Syrian desert toward the outskirts of Raqqa, the capital of the Islamic State's new caliphate. On board, as the New York Times would later report it, rode roughly 24 Delta Force operators. Their target was a cluster of buildings near a disused oil refinery at a place called Ukhairisha, pronounced Ukhairisha. And inside those buildings, according to the best intelligence picture the United States had assembled in a year, were James Foley and more than a dozen other Western hostages. The raid that followed was, by every professional measure, close to flawless, and it is remembered as one of the most painful nights in the unit's modern history because of what the operators found when they reached the cells. The rooms held blankets, food scraps, and human hair. What they did not hold was a single hostage. This video is the documented story of the raid America was never supposed to know about, the night it worked perfectly and failed completely, and the fight that broke out afterward, in public, between a grieving family and the White House, over one question. When was the moment this mission would have succeeded, and who let it pass? Subscribe to War Code, because the timeline you are about to see has hours in it that still have no explanation. Start with the people in the cells, because everything else exists because of them. James Foley was a freelance conflict journalist from New Hampshire, a former teacher who found his way to war reporting in his 30s and filed from the worst places in Libya and Syria for Global Post. He had already been captured once, held for 44 days by Gaddafi's forces in 2011, and when he came home from that, he sat in church halls and classrooms explaining why he had to go back, because somebody had to keep the camera on. He was taken at gunpoint in northern Syria on Thanksgiving Day 2012, and his family spent the next 2 years living inside a silence that has no name. Steven Sotloff, a journalist from Florida who wrote for Time, was grabbed near the Aleppo Road the following summer, and he spent his captivity concealing from his guards that he was Jewish and held Israeli citizenship, secretly fasting on Yom Kippur by telling the jailers he was sick. Kayla Mueller, an aid worker from Arizona, was taken outside a hospital in Aleppo that same August after accompanying a colleague on an assignment, 24 years old when the door closed on her. By the spring of 2014, the Islamic State had consolidated its Western prisoners into one captor network. Around 14 men and women moved between sites in Raqqa's orbit, guarded by a cell of British-accented jailers, the hostages privately nicknamed the Beatles, men whose cruelty survivors would testify about in a federal courtroom years later. Through that spring, the European captives began going home, one embrace at a time, on airport tarmacs, as their governments quietly arranged payments. 4 French journalists crossed into Turkey in April. Spanish reporters walked free the month before. Reporting in the New York Times later mapped that ransom economy in detail. Tens of millions of euros moving through intermediaries, while every government involved denied paying anyone anything. The Americans stayed, and so did the British, among them aid workers David Haynes and Alan Henning, because London holds the same line Washington holds. Their governments do not pay. Every seat that emptied around the remaining hostages made the arithmetic of their own situation harder to ignore, and the men in Fort Bragg tracking the problem understood that arithmetic too, which is why the intelligence effort through that spring carried the urgency it did. Now set the stage the raid flew into, because the timing could not have been worse or the stakes higher. On the 10th of June 2014, the Islamic State took Mosul, a city of nearly 2 million, in 4 days, and columns of captured American armor rolled south, while 2 Iraqi divisions dissolved. On the 29th of June, the group's spokesman declared the caliphate restored and named its leader caliph, and Raqqa, the city just down the road from the hostage sites, became the capital of a self-proclaimed state the size of Britain. The raid at Ukhairisha launched 5 days after that declaration. 5 days. The United States was about to land its most protected soldiers inside a terrorist state at the precise moment that state was announcing itself to history. And if a helicopter went down, every man aboard would be the most valuable prize in jihadist history. The intelligence build ran through the first half of 2014. Freed European hostages were debriefed, and reporting described their accounts as central to the picture. The cell layouts, the guard rotations, the moves between sites, down to the oil facility near Ukhairisha. Overhead, the persistent platforms did what they do. By June, the picture was judged strong enough to take to the president and understand what was actually being weighed. This was not a border raid. It was a helicopter assault into the middle of the Islamic State's home province, sovereign Syrian airspace, no friendly ground within reach, against an enemy that had just shocked the world by taking Mosul. The military term for the target was a denied area. The plain term is the worst address on Earth, and the proposal was to land 24 Americans on top of it and hold it long enough to search every room. Weigh what that authorization cost politically, because it explains some of the caution the Foley family would later condemn. This president had built a foreign policy on the promise of no American boots on the ground in Syria, had walked back from his own red line the previous autumn rather than strike Damascus, and was being asked to approve the first known American ground operation of the entire Syrian war. Behind every White House hostage rescue debate since 1980 sits the same ghost, Desert One, the burned helicopters in the Iranian sand that ended a presidency's credibility in a single night. And behind that sits Mogadishu, a president who approves a raid that ends with operator bodies dragged through Raqqa, does not just lose men, he loses the country's stomach for the entire war. The people in that situation room knew all of it, and they approved the launch anyway, which deserves stating plainly. Whatever else the record shows, when the intelligence community said the picture was sufficient, the order was given. Authorization came, and on the night of July 3rd into July 4th, the package launched. Delta operators reported as the assault element, reconnaissance men from the Ranger Regiment Special Company folded in, the Night Stalkers of the Special Operations Aviation Regiment flying them, a gunship overhead, Predator drones stacked above that, and fighters holding high cover. Hold one more fact about that airspace, because it magnifies everything. In July of 2014, the United States had not flown a single strike mission inside Syria. The air campaign against the Caliphate would not begin for almost 3 more months. Which means the first American military operation of the entire Syrian war was not a bomb from 30,000 feet. It was helicopters full of operators landing on the ground, in the dark, an hour's drive from the enemy's capital, with no rescue infrastructure behind them if the night went wrong. The most cautious White House of the modern era chose men over munitions as its opening move, because only men can carry hostages home. The force hit the ground and did something that tells you everything about the plan's ambition. It blocked the main road out toward Raqqa itself, sealing the objective against the city that headquartered the Caliphate, and then assaulted the suspected hostage house. The rooms came up empty, and then the second half of the night began, because the Islamic State's fighters started arriving from Raqqa in strength, and for roughly 3 hours the assault force fought them off the blocking positions, while teammates worked through the site collecting what the trade calls sensitive material, and what a parent would call unbearable: cell phones, bedding, food remnants, and strands of hair that would later confirm the hostages had been exactly there. One American, a pilot, took a round in the leg when the aircraft drew fire and kept flying. The search work itself has a name in the trade: sensitive site exploitation, and it is a discipline the unit had industrialized across a decade of Iraq raids. Photograph everything, bag everything, swab everything, because the objective you are standing on is also the intelligence for the next objective. The men did that work methodically, in body armor, inside a live gunfight, in the middle of the Caliphate, on a site where every mattress and food wrapper testified that the people they had come for had just been there. When the search was finished and the evidence bagged, the force lifted out through the same hostile sky it had come in on. Every ISIS fighter who pressed the perimeter that night stayed in the dirt at Uqayrisha. The reporting recorded no American dead, and the helicopters crossed back out of Syria carrying 20-something operators, 1 wounded aviator, and no rescued hostages at all. If you are still with the men on those helicopters, you belong with us. Cadets get every video 24 hours early and a badge in the comments. The link is below. The flight home carried its own particular silence. Assault forces debrief everything, and a dry hole gets debriefed hardest of all. Every room diagrammed, every timing reconstructed, every assumption pulled apart on a whiteboard at Fort Bragg within days. The men who do this work are engineers about failure, precisely because they cannot afford to be poets about it. But no debrief format on Earth has a block for the thing everyone on those helicopters understood, that somewhere within driving distance of the objective they had just fought on, The people they came for were sitting against a different wall, still waiting. Now the question that turned this classified raid into a public wound. How long before the wheels touched down had the hostages been moved? The honest answer is that the record disagrees with itself. Officials quoted in the first wave of reporting said the captives had been relocated just days before the raid. At least one detailed reconstruction put it at as little as 24 hours. What no report disputes is the direction of the miss. The intelligence was not wrong about the place. It was late against the clock, and nobody has ever established on the record whether the move was routine paranoia by the captors or whether something alerted them. Sit with the 24-hour version for a moment, because the men on the objective had to. Measured that way, the distance between the most painful night in the unit's recent memory and the greatest hostage rescue in American history was one rotation of the Earth. Through July and August, the secret held. Then, on August 19th, the Islamic State released a video showing James Foley's murder, and it is described here in that single sentence, and no further. The next day, the story of the raid broke loose. The White House had never intended to disclose the operation, and officials said so plainly, but with news organizations hours from publishing, the Pentagon confirmed it on August 20th. Press Secretary Rear Admiral John Kirby's statement carried the sentence that defined the failure. The mission was not successful because the hostages were not present at the targeted location. The confirmation infuriated parts of the special operations community, and those objections made it into print within days. Serving and former officers arguing that publicly confirming a raid inside Syria burned methods, told the captors exactly how close the Americans had come and could push the remaining hostages deeper into the dark. The administration's answer was that the story was coming out regardless and better on the government's terms. Both positions were held by serious people, and the hostages' families were caught between them. Lisa Monaco, the president's counterterrorism advisor, laid out the administration's timeline in one breath. The government had what it believed was sufficient intelligence, and when the opportunity presented itself, the president authorized the Department of Defense to move aggressively to recover the citizens. President Obama, defending the no concessions line that separated the American hostages from their freed European cellmates, said the United States would do everything it could, short of providing an incentive for future Americans to be caught. 2 weeks later, on September 2nd, a second video showed Steven Sotloff's murder, and that sentence, too, ends there. Then Diane Foley started talking, and the country heard something it was not used to hearing from a Gold Star mother of the terror war. Jim's mother said the rescue attempt came very late, that her son's location had been known for more than a year. Her words, from the debriefed European hostages who had lived beside him. She described 3 separate warnings from U.S. officials that paying a ransom could be prosecuted, one of them delivered by a decorated military officer serving on the National Security Council staff, and said her son Michael was directly threatened with prosecution by a State Department official for trying to raise money. So little compassion, she called it. And she said the sentence that still circulates in every discussion of hostage policy: Jim was killed in the most horrific way. He was sacrificed because of just a lack of coordination, lack of communication, lack of prioritization. The administration answered with its own record, the raid itself as proof of seriousness, the legal reality that ransom purchases the next kidnapping, and Monaco's insistence that the government move the moment the intelligence justified moving. Within a year, the public fight forced a formal review, and in June of 2015, the White House rewrote American hostage policy by executive order, creating a permanent interagency fusion cell for hostage recovery, and stating publicly that no family would face prosecution for trying to ransom their own child. Diane Foley built a foundation in her son's name and spent the following decade making sure the change held. Both things remain true at once, and this channel will not pretend otherwise. The policy logic was coherent, and a mother buried her son while the governments that paid walked their citizens home. Here is what the night at Ukairisha actually proved. Stripped of the grief, it proved the machine could do the impossible part. 24 operators flew into the home province of the most feared terrorist army on the planet, sealed a road against its capital, held a 3-hour gunfight at the end of a 1,000-mile supply line of exactly one air corridor, searched the objective to forensic standard under fire, and brought everyone home with a single leg wound. Kayla Mueller, the last American in that network's hands, died in captivity the following winter, and her name belongs in any honest telling of this story. The reckoning came slower than the rescue would have, but it came. The captor network was hunted piece by piece over the years that followed, and in 2022, one of the British jailers, the hostages had named, El-Shafee El-Sheikh, sat in a Virginia federal courtroom while survivors testified, and he will die in an American prison. The men who flew that night have never spoken, and none of the reporting suggests any of them needed convincing to go again. What never came was a second address. The failure at Uqayrishah did not live on the objective, where the execution was clean, or in the cockpit, where a wounded pilot flew his aircraft out. It lived in the seam between knowing and going, the same seam every hostage rescue in history has lived or died in, and on that particular week, in that particular seam, the clock belonged to the enemy. So the argument this video leaves you with is the one the Foleys and the White House never settled, and it has three honest sides. You can hold that the intelligence simply ripened too late, and no one is to blame for the speed of truth. You can hold, with Diane Foley, that a system which knew the building for months moved with too little urgency until the urgency was unbearable. Or you can hold the coldest position of all, that the real gap was never the raid but the ransom line, that Europe bought its people back while America's principles priced its people's lives, and that Foley and Sotloff died of policy, not of intelligence. Veterans, intelligence people, family members, pick your side below and argue it with the seriousness this one deserves, because 14 families lived this timeline, and only some of them got to stop counting. Official members get the versions that do not survive the public cut, the details and accounts we trim before publish. The door is below.